Now, Donald Trump has been sworn in as the 47th president of the United States, completing perhaps the most remarkable political comeback in American history. Announcing that a golden age begins right now, Mr. Trump announced a flurry of policies, including renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, and then taking back the Panama Canal from China. And that's perhaps a signal to his foreign policy approach for the next 4 years. President Trump also announced that a number of executive orders will be signed today, and that includes the national emergency on the southern border, which is meant to halt illegal entry to the U.S. from Mexico and also begin deportations. Now, others are the national energy emergency and another to address public health challenges in the U.S. The president announced that the golden age begins right now, and he called today the Liberation Day. All right, let's bring in our guest. He is, for more development, President Emeritus, Internal Stability, to talk about the internal stability in, President Emeritus, rather, Internal Stability Operations Association, Washington, D.C. Doug Brooks, he joins me on the news this hour. Good to have you join us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I mean, just a lot of statements there made by President Trump, but one of them that really caught everyone's attention is perhaps the first time he will be making that kind of statement, to say that he wants to be known as a peacemaker and a unifier. Is that something that the president could represent for Americans in the next 4 years when you consider his first tenure?
Yeah, that's a really, really great point. Of course, the last time that he left office was not a peaceful transfer of power for the first time in American history. So for him to sort of say that he's going to be unifying people now is probably not exactly going to work out. And of course, if you look at his speech, it's very petty and vindictive. It has some interesting moments at the end where he talks about, new golden age and everything. But he certainly doesn't seem to be offering any, what do you call it, any peace to his political rivals at all.
He also did talk about he's always talked about reclaiming the Panama Canal. He's talked about Greenland. He's talked about Canada being the 51st state of the U.S. And perhaps the first time he's talking about the Gulf of Mexico, now being to be called by him the Gulf of America. Instead of signals to his foreign policy approach for the next 4 years, do you see, some sort of tension back and forth between him and other world leaders? How do you think they will react to some of the comments he has made?
I don't think it's going to be a very favorable reaction from world leaders. They, some of his stuff that he says is just bluster. Maybe he will try to rename the Gulf of Mexico, which has been named the Gulf of Mexico a long, long time. Try and rename it the Gulf of America. He may talk to the Danes about purchasing Greenland, but the people in Greenland have, I think, essentially rejected that. I think it recalls back to when when Trump spoke to the United Nations, to the General Assembly there, and got laughed at. He's not a respected person internationally. Now, he is the head of the most powerful nation on earth, so you have to, give him that much. He has a lot of potential power, but how he's actually going to weld it, and how much Congress and the Supreme Court and the American people are going to allow him to do some of this more crazy stuff that he discusses.
And talking about tax and tariffs, that also seems to be another approach he's going to use. He did that in his first tenure as well. The United States sort of depends on Europe's backing and NATO for the hegemony that it does enjoy. In terms of the relationship between Europe and America, how do you expect it to play out during the Trump administration?
It's a great point. I mean, his whole tariffs thing, he was president, 4 years ago, and was president for 4 years then, and he still has not figured out tariffs. Tariffs are a tax on the people of the country that imposes a tariff. So he's sort of saying, okay, we're going to transfer income tax and start using tariffs to pay for our budget and pay down our debt. But it's ridiculous. Essentially, it just says we're going to tax American citizens to make this happen. So that's a little bit crazy, I'd have to say. I'm glad you brought that up, because it's sort of one of the things where you just have to shake your head, as with any sort of economic background at all, and say, how can he say these things? Because it doesn't make any sense. But, he won the popular vote, and people do believe him. That, somehow these tariffs are going to magically not cost us anything, and that other countries are going to be willing to pay additional money to the United States. So who knows where that's going to go.
And interesting when you mentioned that he won the popular vote and people do believe him, because I was going to ask you how you think Americans are reacting to some of the points he made. Does he speak generally for Americans, if not everyone, but at least some of them? Because even President Biden did clap at some of the comments he made. We saw the bipartisan commendation in terms of the clap and the applause he got on some of the points he made. Does he speak for Americans as he made those points?
Well, he didn't win over 50% of the American voters. He did win the popular vote by just under 1.5%. So he has a slight margin in terms of the popular vote, which is pretty surprising. It's been a long time since a Republican was able to win the popular vote. So he has that. Now, to sort of say that that's a mandate or that most Americans are going to agree with him on this stuff, I think that's probably a bit of a stretch. I think there's going to be a honeymoon period, if you might say that, where people are going to see what he's going to actually do and how that's going to be portrayed, or how it's going to pan out. But I don't know how long that will last. I mean, if you could just imagine, he's talking about deporting anywhere between 11 and 20 million people, and men, women, and children, and using the troops to do that. It's not going to be pretty if he's actually going to give this a try. And it may not even be legal or constitutional, so we'll have to see how that goes through the courts. But that's, was one of his platforms that he ran on, and I think people are going to see what happens when he tries to get this done.
Another very interesting point I thought he sort of made speaks to some of the issues around the Black Lives Matter and how those who are the minorities in America sort of feel about, how they are treated. And he talked about, sort of forging a society that is colorblind and merit-based. This is a century-long issue. It didn't begin with Donald Trump. And I wonder if it can end with Donald Trump.
Well, yeah, I think it will always be an issue of concern. I mean, it's interesting that Trump, for example, did quite well with Hispanics in the United States, and that was kind of unusual for him to win this. And I think that a lot of Black Americans actually stayed away from the polls this time. Maybe they didn't vote for Trump, but they didn't vote for Harris either. They stayed away for whatever reason. So I think for him to, but for him, and he comes from a party, the sort of MAGA party that he's developed, that really has some very negative racial overtones and fascist overtones, according to some people. The idea that he's going to be some sort of person who ends the sort of racial issues that the United States struggles with all the time, I think is a bit of a stretch.
All right, Doc Brooks, just a lot to watch out for, especially in terms of some of the executive orders he has mentioned he will be signing today. Immigration is a sticking point. We'll watch out for some of those executive orders. Thank you so much for your time. President Emeritus, Internal Stability Operations Association, Washington, D.C., Doc Brooks.
Thank you very much.